Iran says it's in the final stages of drafting an agreement with Oman on shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz. The two countries are on opposite sides of the narrow waterway, which carries a fifth of the world's oil and gas supply. Reports suggest that under the agreement, Tehran would have control over ships entering the Gulf through the strait, while Oman would oversee outbound shipping. If the deal goes through, it would signal a major shift in the balance of regional power in Tehran's favor. And I'm now joined by Megan Sutcliffe. She's an analyst for the Middle East and Africa at Sibylline. That's a risk assessment consultancy agency. Megan, given that much of the information is coming from unnamed regional officials and negotiations that have previously collapsed, how much confidence should we place in the reports that a Strait of Hormuz deal is imminent?
Well, I would say that given that we have not had any official statements from Oman or from the United States regarding any potential agreement with Iran, that at most we should evaluate these reports with cautious optimism, but not necessarily confidence. Over the past few days, Iran has repeatedly stated that negotiations with Oman on reopening the Strait of Hormuz are progressing, and that indeed a final statement is forthcoming. But this is not a guarantee of progress or indeed of de-escalation with the United States. The situation remains extremely tense, and the next few days will be absolutely key in determining whether or not this vital global trade artery reopens in good time.
Now, the Reuters news agency says that Iran had warned the Gulf states to tell Trump to desist or we will hit you hard. That's a quote. Will Gulf allies put pressure on Trump, do you think?
It's highly likely that that is the case. This Reuters report essentially goes back to the threat that President Trump issued last weekend when he said that he was preparing to engage in a major offensive targeting Iran, but eventually pulled back following diplomatic intervention from the Gulf monarchies. This type of pressure is not anything new. We have often seen the Gulf monarchies calling for restraint because they have been, of course, the primary recipients of Iranian retaliation following US airstrike campaigns. Should the US re-engage with Iran, it's highly likely we would see Iran targeting these states once again, and therefore this type of pressure on the US to de-escalate is entirely in line with Gulf objectives at this point in time.
Now, if an agreement is indeed announced, do you think it would represent a genuine breakthrough toward ending the war? Or is it more likely to be a temporary arrangement focused on shipping and easing economic pressure rather than the underlying conflict?
Well, at present, it would appear that an agreement on reopening the Strait of Hormuz is certainly going to be a necessary factor and a necessary foundation when it comes to establishing a broader ceasefire. However, even if it is agreed, that doesn't guarantee transition into productive negotiations with the United States or indeed a broader agreement between the US and Iran. Indeed, there have been two ceasefires to date that have hinged on this idea that reopening the Strait of Hormuz would trigger broader de-escalation. And we're still in a holding pattern in the region in which the US engages in repeated airstrikes and Iran continues to retaliate. So while I would say that an agreement on shipping between Iran and Oman is a necessary step towards the establishment of a ceasefire, alone it will not be sufficient in finding an end to the conflict that, of course, has now been going on for almost 6 months.
Now, Donald Trump says a deal could be announced within days, but he has also alternated between threatening military action and supporting diplomacy. How much uncertainty does Trump's track record of changing course create for both the negotiators and also for other regional actors there?
It certainly creates a great deal of concern and a great deal of uncertainty. Some have framed Trump's approach to negotiations, and particularly his public statements, as being in line with strategic ambiguity, essentially attempting to modulate pressure on Iran by criticizing it extremely harshly and threatening re-escalation, while also presenting diplomacy as a viable off-ramp from those tensions. Unfortunately, while it would appear, though, that Trump's statements have been ambiguous, it's not necessarily clear whether they have been strategic. We're still looking at a Strait of Hormuz that is effectively closed. We are still looking at a region that is facing major uncertainty and in the event of re-escalation would almost certainly see conflict resuming once again without a clear path towards de-escalation and diplomacy.
Now, let's take a quick look ahead. What would you be watching in the coming days and weeks to determine actually whether this is the beginning of a durable settlement or whether the agreement is at risk of breaking down again?
There are two things that I'll be watching particularly closely over the next few weeks that would be indicative, potentially, of progress towards ceasefire. The first will, of course, be these negotiations between Iran and Oman. If we see both states issuing statements indicating that negotiations are progressing productively, that they have agreed on coordinates for shipping routes into and out of the Persian Gulf, for example, that would indicate that we are heading towards an agreement that is more palatable both for the region and for the United States. The second thing that I would look at very closely is whether or not we have direct negotiations between the US and Iran. Presently, we haven't had those talks resuming. Essentially, contact has been through diplomatic back channels. And while, of course, that does indicate that there is at least some kind of contact between both parties and that they are actively discussing potential routes for diplomatic de-escalation, over the past few months, it has only been after direct meetings between Iranian officials and American officials that we have actually seen agreements translating from intention into paper that can be signed. If we were to see those two things occurring, essentially Iran and Oman agreeing on the Strait of Hormuz, and then a meeting between the US and Iran, that would indicate to me that we are heading towards a more durable ceasefire and one that will potentially de-escalate this situation in a way that unfortunately we have yet to see.
Megan Sutcliffe, the analyst for the Middle East and Africa at Sibylline. Many thanks.
Thank you.
All right, joining me now is Alan Eyre. He spent almost 4 decades in the U.S. government. He was a core member of the U.S. team that negotiated the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran. He's now a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. Alan, it's good to have you back on the program. Let me ask you, is this really a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, or are we watching the gradual international recognition of Iranian control over who enters the Gulf?
Great question, Brent. And the word reopening implies that we're returning to a previous state before the February 28th kickoff of the war. That's not the case. It's going to be a reopening, or at least a partial reopening, if this Strait of Hormuz deal gets done, but it will be under Iranian control, and it will take a long time before maritime volumes get back to that pre-war level of 130 ships a day. So it's baby steps, best case.
Washington has insisted that the strait must remain open, free of Iranian control, and without mandatory fees. Iran has sought authority over incoming ships and reportedly discussed charging vessels according to the value of their cargo. Who now has to back down?
The U.S. has to back down in all probability, Brent. That ship, no pun intended, has sailed. Iran is going to have operational control of the Strait of Hormuz. They're not necessarily seeking to monetize it right off the bat. The first 30, 60 days, they might say no tolls or service charges. What's key for them is the strategic deterrence of having operational control of the strait. Once that's established as the new norm, then they can always introduce service charges or fees or tolls. So a massive setback for the principle in international law of freedom of navigation, I fear, will have lost on that.
Oman is presenting itself here as a neutral mediator. If an agreement is in the works, do you see Oman as helping to solve a temporary crisis, or is it helping create a new regional order?
Well, Oman is the necessary interface with Iran to determine the future of the strait. Iran and the U.S. have never negotiated in any detail on anything, and so it's good that the U.S. is sitting this one out. It is still consulting with the Omanis, and more importantly, the Omanis are consulting with the other GCC, the other Gulf countries. So the main diplomatic action is Oman representing the Gulf countries on one side and Iran on the other. Now, the U.S. will have to approve any deal those two sides reach, because one of the key prerequisites for the deal for Iran is lifting the naval blockade on Iran that the U.S. Navy has imposed that is causing so much economic pain.
Earlier this week, you said Iran had concluded that it could not rely on anything that Washington promised. You also questioned whether meaningful negotiations were actually taking place. What has changed? Has anything changed?
No, I think the United States administration is incapable of or unwilling to negotiate with Iran, so they've outsourced it. They outsourced it to Pakistan and Qatar. when we were talking about nuclear issues. And now that the key strategic issue is the Strait of Hormuz and getting that open as quickly as possible to minimize global economic damage, Oman is the key interface, and Oman is talking to the United States. So, I mean, all the United States has done up until now, Brent, is bomb Iran in the hopes of bringing about Iranian capitulation. That hasn't happened, and it's unlikely to happen. So now other people have to take up the lead with diplomacy.
A previous understanding, this memorandum of understanding, it collapsed within weeks amid disputes over shipping routes, attacks on vessels, sanctions relief. Why would ship owners, why would insurers or Gulf governments, why would they trust a new agreement?
They're not. That's the whole point. I mean, any agreement is going to have to stand the test of time. You know, the key maritime insurers who are London-based, the vessel owners, the people who have cargo, you know, day one of any agreement, they're not going to rush to go back into the Persian Gulf. That's why it's going to take a lot of time. This war has disrupted global supply chains. These big ships that go through the strait, they move at 20 miles an hour. They're really slow. So even if it's all systems ahead, it's a glacial pace. But you're quite right, Brent, is that it's going to take a track record of months and months and months of nothing bad happening to ships going through the strait for the numbers to start building up again.
Yeah, it's going to be a slow process, as you say. President Trump, he began this war, we all remember, demanding Iran's unconditional surrender. Could he now present an agreement that gives Tehran formal influence over the Strait of Hormuz as an American victory?
Well, he can present it any way he wants. You know, there's what's the phrase, putting lipstick on a pig? That could happen. The underlying reality is that we have lost what we call the Hormuz War, the battle over the future of the Strait of Hormuz. That's in the loss column. And I'm frankly doubtful that we'll ever get an agreement on the nuclear issue. Now, President Trump and the administration can say Iran has promised never to have a nuclear weapon. It already seems that they're starting to say that there's going to be freedom of navigation through the strait, though it's not the case. So, you know, one issue is reality. The other issue is how both sides, not just the U.S., but Iran, decide to spin it.
I'm wondering, too, could an agreement over the Strait of Hormuz, could that provide a bridge to wider negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, or would it merely freeze the most dangerous part of the conflict while leaving the war itself unresolved?
That's a key question. It seems to me, Brent, that President Trump just wants to extricate himself from this mess as quickly as possible. Solving the nuclear issue will take serious and sustained negotiations. I was a member of the Obama administration nuclear negotiating team. It took 5 years, and 2 of those was hardcore diplomacy. So it's a real question whether the Trump administration wants to roll up its sleeves and actually put effective diplomatic constraints on Iran's nuclear program, or whether at this point he just wants to declare victory and get the heck out of there.
Well, Alan, you've had a lot of experience in Washington. Can you explain why we're not seeing more criticism, even maybe revolting within Washington over what has happened here? Because the U.S. did not go to war to deal with the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. went to war and created a problem, which is now the Strait of Hormuz. Why are people not angry about that?
Well, if you look at the polling of the American people, I mean, this is an incredibly unpopular war. I think it's the low 20s. So the vast majority of Americans do not approve of this war and the way President Trump has handled it. Obviously, President Trump has total control of the Republican Party, but even within the Republican Party, we've got midterm elections coming up, and a lot of these Republicans are fearful of the political consequences of a worsening economy, of high gasoline prices, of high diesel prices, of headlines about ceasefires being violated. So although President Trump doesn't seem to be personally concerned, the Republican Party is, but they're not going to say anything out loud. Yeah. But certainly anyone who follows the issue realizes this is a massive strategic blunder.
Alan Eyre, always good to have you on the program. We appreciate your insights tonight. As always, thank you.
Thank you, Brent.